welcome from wherever you are in the UK or around the world. And I hope it's not too late to say this, but also a happy new year to you as well. And welcome to the session, which is about kind of the role of supply chains and routes to market in supporting diverse agroecological farming. So we're thinking about different scales of farming, from small, medium to large, different types of farming and supply chains, how these can coexist and move towards this sort of agroecological future. We're going to have 4 fantastic speakers plus myself. So first off, you're going to hear from Katie Bliss from the Organic Research Centre and myself from the Sustain Alliance. We're going to try and set the scene a little bit and talk about some of the work that we've done over the past few years. We'll then hear from 3 amazing practitioners who are working to change the food system in this way. So you'll get to hear from Julie Brown from Growing Communities, Josiah Meldrum from Hodmeddod, and George Young from Fobbing Farms. So we're really hoping to have a really good, rich conversation talking about supply chains, routes to market, agroecology of different scales and types, and how, yeah, we can start moving towards that future and that kind of connecting, playing role that everything plays within the food system. And then after those talks, we'll be going into breakout rooms, and those will be an opportunity for you to ask questions and also to add to the discussion yourself. And yeah, we're really keen to sort of hear any thoughts or experiences you've had in this sort of space, and what's worked on either a local, regional, or even a national level. But we're really keen to hear some sort of local and regional stuff as well. And then we'll get everybody back into the main room after that, do a very quick sum up, and we will then close there. So yeah, we're just quickly to say that we appreciate there's lots of other sessions going on today and at the same time as this, which are similar. So hopefully we'll be complementing and building on those as well. And a lot of the information and discussion that we're going to have today will really be kind of feeding into the work that we're all doing. And helping us kind of continue to push for that change in the UK food system, so that it's better, it's more equitable, it's more agroecological. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'm going to quickly share my screen and do the first talk before handing over to Katie. So hopefully you can see that okay. Right. So yes. So this is the title of the session today. And I'm going to be quickly talking about some work that Sustain did last year, which was doing a bit of market research, trying to understand what farmers see as the opportunities, the needs and the barriers of changing the supply chain that they use. So we surveyed about 500 English and Welsh farmers of all different sizes and types. So it's really interesting data because it's looking at different sort of scales and types of farming. And we wanted to, as I said, understand those barriers, those needs, those opportunities, and really try and kind of paint a bit of a picture of what kind of future British farmers want and why. So we asked farmers where they supply to and where they would prefer to supply to. And the data we got back I thought was quite interesting. So out of those 500 farmers, 85% said that they supply via a supply chain that we called kind of supermarket. And very few supplied to things like the food hubs and the direct consumer and the independent retailers. But when we asked them where they would prefer to supply to, the numbers kind of almost flipped on their head a bit. So really interestingly, only 5% said that they would prefer to sell to a supermarket, whereas the numbers on things like food hubs, direct consumer, independent retailers, food service and hospitality, those numbers went up quite a bit to what you can see there. So I think what this showed us is that farmers don't necessarily not want to supply to supermarkets, but they really want to diversify their markets and supply more to these different ones that you see on the screen there. So I think that's a really good indicator of where farmers want to go in the future. And we asked them why they want to do this, and these were the top answers that they gave. So they felt that they would get a better price, they would be able to continue being a commercial farm and selling, good quantities of food and produce, that they would be rewarded more for doing more for climate and nature. We actually structured that question a little bit wrongly, and we asked lots of different things about soil, water, climate, nature. So that number will probably be a lot more if we digged into the detail of the data, which we haven't had a chance to do yet. And then others included, they felt it would make their business more resilient, that they would have a much better connection and relationship with citizens, and that they would be able to offer better employment opportunities. And we also tried to understand some of the key barriers as well. And these were the top four that were chosen. So a lack of access to what we sort of termed affordable finance to be able to invest in change. A lot of farmers felt they had either a lack of time or knowledge to do their own marketing, their own market research and that sort of thing. A lot felt that they didn't have a local market already established in their area. And sort of lastly, some felt that they didn't have access to the kinds of infrastructure locally to be able to make that change. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a, kind of paints a bit of a picture for the session, and is, yeah, it's kind of an indicator of where farmers might like to go or like to see the food system shift going forwards. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Katie Bliss.
Hi there. Can you see that? Is that coming up? Hi. Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Katie Bliss. I'm an agroecologist at the Organic Research Centre, and I'm based down in Cornwall, based in Falmouth, and I'm actually backstage at the pavilion here, and we've got a local screening. So looking forward to having this conversation at a local level. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of a large 5-year European project that has set the context for this conversation, really, in a nutshell. So ultimately, it starts with the fact that, there we go, nature doesn't do monocultures. So natural ecosystems are composed of a diversity of species with complex interactions, which enables resilience, stability, and sustainability within those systems. So they're not dependent on external inputs, apart from sun, air. And so how can we look at building diversity within our farming systems? And so this has been a very common theme over the last few days, in terms of how can we seek to build that resilience, stability through practices like strip cropping and intercropping, integrating forgotten and novel crops, rotation, so particularly with pulses, and companion and track cropping. So within the project, there's a network of field experiments and on-farm innovation and monitoring across Europe. And the data is showing that although there are trade-offs, overall it's demonstrating a huge number of beneficial impacts. So increased resource use efficiency, particularly land use efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency, water and biodiversity, resilience to pests and disease, and climate resilience as well. Although there were trade-offs there, there were cases where extremes of weather has led to crop failures, but overall, in terms of the systems with this diversity, is seeing high levels of climate resilience. But what we're getting onto in this session is that despite all that, farmers are locked in. So the mainstream supply chain is not set up for small volumes of diverse crops, storage, processing and transport. And we've talked a lot about this earlier as well, and it obviously came up in your work as well, James. The market doesn't valorize the benefits. There's policy and legislative barriers, in particular things around food safety and access for smaller producers, access to small scale processing equipment, so separation and milling when we're looking at the arable systems, workload in terms of labour organisation on the farm and kind of prioritising how to manage that workload, and the new skills required. So a big part of the project is looking at how to unlock these barriers. So using a co-innovation approach, we've worked with 25 case studies across Europe, with real-world actors who are enabling crop diversity along the value chain. And so one of those cases is working together with the lovely Hodmeddods, and looking at co-learning within that network. So the Hodmeddod farmers, processors, bakers, different people engaged, and consumers. And I think this is really just to introduce, and George and Josiah will get in much more into the nitty-gritty of that, but some of the key insights that have come through from that is this kind of shift from the idea of a linear supply chain to these networks, these diverse networks, and the social capital that comes with that, So relationships, knowledge sharing, enabling that feedback, questions around, well, no questions, there is no question around fair pricing. Again, echo your work, James, how that can then reflect the risk sharing, valorize those benefits and recognize the farmer intellectual property that's going into this work. Potential collaboration and cooperation. So as part of this case study, we've done some exchanges with other initiatives in Sweden and France, and there we've seen a lot more collaboration and cooperation at a local level with on-farm processing and storage hubs. So looking at the potential for that as well. And then a key part being enhancing the consumer understanding and being able to tell the story. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, and George and Josiah will tell us a little bit more later. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Casey. Okay, so next we're going to move on to Julie Brown from Growing Communities, who's going to share the story of Growing Communities and how they've been supporting farmers. Julie, if I can hand over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm going to share my screen. I wanted to give you a whistle-stop tour, literally a whistle-stop tour of the last 25 years. I thought that that would be the most straightforward and way to show you practically what we've done in terms of working on the supply chain in our area. So starting out, here we are back in 1922, whenever it was. Yeah, we started out a few years ago now, 25 years ago, based in Hackney in Northeast London. We started out by setting up a CSA scheme. We looked for the closest farm, organic farm we could find to London, and the idea was that we would go to the farm and actively help out with providing work in practice and labour for the farm. In practice, what happened is that an hour and a half, 2 hours outside London, which is the closest place, we couldn't actually provide any realistic and ongoing labour to the farm. We had some really nice times there, but we certainly weren't helping out, I think, in any real practical sense. Also, so we wanted to find some land in London, and also we were complete novices. We didn't know a hungry gap existed, and we wanted to keep our farmers on, you know, our members on board throughout the year. So essentially what we did was we switched from a CSA model to a box scheme model, and we found a small piece of land in London. We started growing some of our own produce, a small amount of salads and leafy greens, but essentially we started trading with wholesaler languages at that point. So we moved from direct to aggregating. Bit later, so we could bring in produce from further afield. A bit later than that, Easter, Josiah, who was heavily involved in Easter at that point, we were the the first producer co-op in the UK, I think, based in East Anglia. They found us, I think, or we found them, can't quite remember, the missed time, but basically we started trading with them. A bit later, we decided to set up our farmers market. So we reached out and found a whole range of farmers in Kent and Essex who would come directly and supply a farmers market. So that was, we started looking at livestock and arable as part of that, mainly, not a lot of arable, you have to process it, but along with the fruit and veg that we were supplying through the box scheme. So Easter kind of sadly sort of folded as a producer co-op at that time. So I think that might have been the first and the last and the only producer co-op. Interesting in terms of what farmers said in the survey about setting up producer co-ops. But Graham, who was one of the key players in that, carried on. He set up a wholesaling operation. So we continued to wholesale with East Anglian farmers, and he was supplying us directly with his own produce too. So some of the farmers from the farmers market then began to start being able to supply the box scheme. So we had more farmers coming into the box scheme that way. And our original farm ceased trading at some time around that time. Then what happened? Oh, then we decided we set up a startup program. So essentially a centralized sort of replication and growth strategy, where, you know, we went out to other communities and basically offered to help them set up similar schemes. So a number of those schemes, in fact, most of the schemes turned out to be in London. So we had a whole load of farmers, retailers in London, who then were started to trade with our farmers. So some of those farmers started delivering to multiple retailers within London. So we ended up with all of this going on. Then we decided to set up a peri-urban farm in Dagenham, which is there. And then there were a whole range of other people who were doing similar peri-urban projects. So we had projects setting up in Sutton, Hawkwood, Forty-Hall, and most recently Setopia. Then the startup program, this is 25 years, remember, the startup program morphed into becoming the Better Food Traders Network. So we brought more retailers on board to join the gang, some of whom were based in London. So then Languages were actually ending up supplying nearly all of those, many of these retailers. So what then happened? Meanwhile, Graham started to think about stopping wholesaling into London. And thinking about retiring. Languages moved further out of London. So basically, long story short, we set up something called the Better Food Shed at that point. So all of those, so rationalising all of those deliveries into London, making life a huge amount more easier for all of those farmers. We were also now in a position to directly trade with some of the larger growers that we would have been getting from Language in the past. So we started trading directly with some of those. But we're also had enough buying power to continue the relationship with Language, who've been very important to us over the years as well. So we could continue trading with them. That benefited both parties, but we're also able to rationalise some of their distribution routes into London as well. So anyway, that's where we got. Other things that happened was that Graham gradually reduced his wholesale, and now he's happily selling his own produce to us. And some of the growers turn out to be customers as well. So they run their own box scheme. So they were basically starting to trade with the shed too. So buying in and selling out. And then some of the peri-urban growers as well are now selling some of their produce into the box scheme as well, into the shed as well, into their own box schemes. So that's the whistle-stop tour of how it's happened. In terms of the Better Food Shed, I'm not going to tell you what the route within London is, but essentially we're very, very excited that they're, well, excited. It's challenging in terms of Danny and the team down there, but they've just introduced an electric van to do that distribution within London by electric van. And I think it's fair to say that as well as massively reducing the stresses on the farmers are really happy with the shed. It's also done that for the retailers. And I really want to pay tribute to Danny and the Better Food Shed team, because I hope they do an amazing job. And I hope, I'm sure it feels like this some weeks, they haven't taken all the stresses from all those farmers and all the retailers and piled them into the shed. Like I say, I think on some weeks it definitely feels like that. They do an amazing job. Okay, so within London, as and on the customer side, the last mile bit, which is a massive amount of the carbon footprint of a lot of home delivery systems. We have most of the retailers in the network trade through a collection point system, and we have around 150 collection points in London. And then in terms of growing communities, from our packing area, we are increasing, and the way that we deliver from those to the collection points, we're increasingly transferring that to a cargo bike system over the course of the next 2 weeks, from a van to a cargo bike. Meanwhile, the Better Food Traders Network has grown over the last couple of years to include another 40 groups, and we're in the middle of, we have a funding application pending. I don't know if there's in Feb, and I probably shouldn't say more about that, but we're hoping to expand that into up to 400 or so groups that we think are out there. I'm pretty sure they're out there. We will find you. Okay, so what does it add up to in terms of retail terms? So I'm not going to go through all those numbers because I'm speaking really, really fast already, and I'm aware that I'm probably running out of time. But we've estimated that, I'm just looking at this thing here, the grand total of money of retail sales going through the whole of the wider BFT network is around £9.33 million. So if there were 400 more BFTs out there, and I'm pretty sure that there are, then the whole of this distribution network could be responsible for £93 million worth of sales. We don't know. We don't have the data for that, and that's part of what we want to do here. How does it compare? Riverford, 75 million. So on a par with that. Tesco's 49 billion. I mean, I don't know what to say about that really. I did have things to say, and I'm sure we will have things to say in the breakout session. I'm just going to leave it there for now. So what does this relocalized system look like? Well, in fact, it looks less like this and more like this. I tried to get the most tangled up, and it's lovely to see all those lines, but The system has lots of diversity in it. It has a great, crop diversity, but a range of farming operations. It's mainly horticulture, but there's some livestock and some arable, a range of scales of operations. So we've got in the farming operations and in the retailer, so from the micro to the medium to the large. And we have a range of routes to market, box schemes, farmers market, shops, CSA schemes, a whole load of stuff that probably we don't even know the names of yet. I mean, my term is beautifully messy. For this system, and that's what makes it resilient, but that's also what makes it challenging in terms of the next, in terms of before I move on to the next thing, which is about scaling up. But what I wanted to say is that every arrow in that neat system, or every bit of wool in here, is actually a relationship which is based on trust, mutual respect, and a commitment to what we're increasingly calling farmer-focused trade. What do we mean by farmers-focused trade? It's prioritising trading with climate and nature-friendly farmers, providing those farmers with enough money to reflect the public goods they provide, and paying them promptly. So in our system, 50% of over 50% of the sale price goes to the farmers when they sell through the growing community supplies, the system, and that's more than 3 times they would get in the global supermarket system. So, and the third element of it, third element, which is very important, is that is supporting seasonal consumption. So we have flexible and adaptable buying and sourcing policies which play to the strengths of what farmers can grow throughout the year. And then we complement that with customer education, with engagement. So they get on board with the seasonal thing, they understand, they learn how to cook, all of that. And that helps build connection and community with our customers, our members, in fact. And this is very much in the spirit of something James Rebank, quote, the author in Farmers, said recently, which is that our diet should be shaped by what works for the land. Okay, so in terms of scaling up and scaling out, I mean, I've really struggled with what to say on this, so I'm just going to blah through a few things and pick out a few stuff. Aggregation for us was a very significant point, the point at which we started aggregating, and for us in an urban area with large populations. But the key thing that is running through this whole system is the principle of remaining farmer focused while you're aggregating. So you're taking practical decisions about where and when it makes sense. But you're not just doing that in the pursuit of economies of scale and to improve efficiency. Not that pursuing economies of scale and improving efficiency are not reasonable things to do. But that approach in the supermarket's hands has led to us an ongoing downward pressure on pricing to farmers and increasing pressure on farms, I think, to scale up, to become larger, more monocultural, less diverse, less messy. So in terms of the growth model that we've pursued, we pursued a citizen, a community-led, a decentralized and a not-for-profit approach. And that's maybe that's made it relatively slow, but it's been slow and steady. And there are no hedge funds in here. And I think if you're committed to farmer-focused trade, then I don't believe there is enough money in this system to extract profit for shareholders or pay high prices, even if you wanted to, which we don't. So we need a diversity of approaches and solutions. So what is needed, or will work, and this has been so clear in terms of the discussions we've had with the Better Food Traders on the Better Food Traders sessions that we've been having earlier in the day and yesterday, is that, what's going to work in different places is different. And the urban areas are different from the rural areas, population density. But this is not a blank sheet of paper. There is lots going on out there. And what we need to do is understand it. What we need to do is understand what's happening in different areas and then come up with appropriate steps for what needs to work there. I put here local food infrastructure analysis. Somebody tweeted something around that and I thought, oh, that sounds like that's what we need. We need that. Okay, so we need to balance supply and demand as we're doing this growth. It's really tricky doing that. It's a real chicken and the egg. How do you get the farmers on board? Do you get the customers on board? Building and keeping customers, it takes time, resources, skills, local knowledge. I think that most farmers are not best placed to do this, particularly when it comes to urban, highly populated areas. And quite frankly, they've got enough to do, and we want them to do that. It needs other players to come in, middle people, working to harness the demand of their communities and driving that towards those farmers, which is ultimately going to drive this whole endeavour. So I'm kind of going to leave it there, really. I mean, basically, if we underpin our scaling up and our scaling out with farmer-focused principles, I believe we won't go down the route that the supermarkets have gone down, which they went down in a certain way for inevitable reasons. And what we'll come up with is something that is efficient, that is financially viable, and it's beautifully messy at the same time. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I feel myself. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was really fascinating, and I think it really well depicted how things have evolved over time and how things don't just stay static, and how you can keep evolving and changing. And I think that's really good. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so next we're going to hear from Josiah Meldrum from Hodmeddod. So Josiah, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks very much. What a brilliant talk, Julie. What a fantastic roller coaster through 25 years, some of which I was kind of peripherally involved with, and it's really exciting to see how Growing Communities has grown. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen now. Brilliant. So my name's Josiah Meldrum, and I'm the co-founder of a business called Hodmeddod, and we work very directly with a group of about 25 or 30 farmers on the production of arable crops, so crops that are really quite anonymous within commodity supply chains. They're things that we don't really think about when we're eating. If you go for a curry, you might think about the meat in the curry or the veg beside the curry, but it's very rare for people to really directly ask about the rice. Oh, and my slideshow is transitioning without my permission. So my journey is going to be a bit different to Julie's presentation, in that I am going to take a sort of personal perspective over the last 10 or 12 years, which has seen Hodmeddod develop. But to start with, I'm going to go right back to the 70s and to my childhood in the 70s and 80s, and this amazing photograph, which is called Earthrise, which was taken by one of the Apollo missions, and that incredible change in our perception of our planet as this fragile blue sphere floating in space, and these global narratives that emerge from that about that fragility and about the threat to our ecosystems, and the understanding that this big planet was actually something that we could very directly affect. And of course, now we know that we're in the Anthropocene and that we are shaping a geological epoch, and that is quite an extraordinary thing. And I think it's worth remembering what motivates us to do all of this. And we are in an extinction and biodiversity loss crisis. Let's not skirt around that. Let's face that full on and acknowledge why it is we need to make the changes we need to make. So as I was growing up, I was very familiar with pictures like this, and we saw them a lot on the news, and they're still on the news, and I feel quite kind of choked up seeing them now. And this is the destruction that we are inflicting upon the earth through anonymous commodity supply chains. We are so distanced from this destruction that we do not feel directly responsible for it. And I think, that motivated me to become an ecologist. And I realized after university that actually what we really need to be engaging with is the interface between people and the planet around us, and to begin to realize and to fully understand and acknowledge that we're part of nature, and that we need to work in harmony, sympathy, empathy, all of those things. And so from there, I thought initially that the thing to do was to go overseas and to help the people that were destroying the environment, not destroy the environment. What a horrific colonial attitude I had. And I did international development at the University of East Anglia, which was a fascinating course. And what it taught me was to take a global perspective. We in East Anglia cut down our temperate rainforests in the Iron Age when settled agriculture came. And since that time, we've continued to denude biodiversity through, and particularly post-war, a very unsympathetic approach to farming, which has been heavily focused on yield and productivity. The measure of success on a farm post-World War II has been how much wheat, how much barley, how much sugar, whatever the commodity crop you're growing is. And that's led to landscapes like this. This is just the edge of my village. And from a farming perspective, I completely understand the drivers that have led to that happening, and I completely get it. And we're all complicit in this landscape, but it's not the way forward. And we need to be creating things that look a lot more like this. And this is Wakeland's agroforestry, fantastic session this morning, which I recommend you look at if you weren't there on replay. this is an incredibly diverse system. It's actually more productive than the huge arable fields you see around it, and yet at the same time, it's working more harmoniously with natural ecosystems. And that's what we need to get to. And the question is, how do we get there? And there are all sorts of structural issues, and there are all sorts of issues around price and access, which I'm sure we'll discuss. But the fundamental thing is, how do we get the crops from these farms into people's hands, onto their plates? How do we communicate the value of this system, the broad value, the externalities that are being considered here? How do we get that understanding into all of our hands and all of our spaces? And I think that is going to come through a very different set of relationships with food and the food system. And that's what over the last 10 or 15 years I've been very focused on. And I think one of the big problems is that we have a very linear perspective on how value chains work. We tend to think, and you know, this is from primary school up, you've got the farmer at one end, you've got the customer at the other end, and you've maybe got a few gatekeepers in the middle. And those gatekeepers muddy the water. They blur our idea about what's happening on farm. They tell us lies, frankly. They mislead us. They use advertising to sell us, frankly, crap. And it has to change. And we have to get back in touch with where our food has come from and the people that are involved. And that needs a new kind of relational supply network rather than this very reductive linear supply chain. So some interesting things have happened, and they've been brought about by technology over the last couple of decades that I think are really positive. So historically, we can think about an evolution of trust. And historically, that would have been very local. You would have known your farmer in the farming context. You would have bought from them. You'd have known what they were doing, and you'd have made choices about their actions and the relationship you had with them. And then in the 20th century, late 19th century, 20th century, that trust became more institutionalized. As supply chains, as they are, got longer, we would rely on brokers, middlemen, or whatever you want to call them, to communicate with us that valuable information. And that's where the muddiness creeps in. And you can see that either as a supermarket, but you might also see it as an organic certification body. That's the other way of looking at it, who are the kind of communicators of trust through that system. And that served us really all the way through the 20th century until where we are now. And now we have this, what's described as a distributed model of trust. And you can see that in things like, I don't know, Airbnb or the review systems that these software models use. You can see it through blockchain. I'm not particularly interested in blockchain. But I think we can also see it through social media functions, apps, all that kind of thing, messaging, very simple technologies that aren't designed or built for food systems, but do allow food systems to open up and become more transparent. So the question is, how do we use these distributed models of trust? And how do we create these networks of supply? And how do we move away from those linear, reductive, distancing models? And that's really what Hodmeddod is all about. We want to create a network of supply. And my picture is pretty, but possibly not very confusing. I think Julie's mass of wool is exactly the same thing, really, which is to say, you know, if the purple spot is us, the dark purple spot is us down in the bottom there, and the black relationships are our direct relationships with the black lines, the direct relationships we have with distributors and retailers and seed banks and researchers. That's one side of it. And then Hodmeddod can also facilitate connections between those different stakeholders, or whatever you want to call them. They're often actually overlapping. To sort of display them as separate is misleading. So we can become an enabler and a facilitator in a network, and that we could be connected to other facilitators and enablers, and that we really need to create this agroecological or regenerative retail that nurtures and supports the production base, whilst at the same time working with customers and consumers to explain to them how those systems work and what the wider benefits are. So how did we go about doing that? And I have to say, we didn't start with that as a starting point. This is something, these are ideas that evolve. So collaborative, open, diverse, transparent, built on trust and relationships, and not transactional, not just relying on those economic transactions. How much can I extract from this relationship? So we started in Norwich, and at the time, Nick, William and I were part of an NGO called East Anglia Food Link, and we'd done a lot of work with a range of everything from school food procurement through to helping set up Easter Organics, which Julie mentioned. And we'd begun looking a lot more at grassroots co-production of food. And we worked with Transition Norwich, part of the Global Transition Network, to understand whether the city could feed itself, what infrastructure would be required and what would be necessary in order to make that happen. And it began really as just a desk-based exercise. We created some big spreadsheets looking at macronutrient, micronutrient, land use type. It's a fun exercise, but frankly meaningless. And when we finished that and presented it to Transition Norwich, said, that's brilliant, let's do it, let's make it happen. And we had no idea how to actually practically start that, because we were NGO, you know, we were consultants effectively. We go and tell people what to do, not actually do it. And so suddenly we had this moment where we had to engage with the community, with the wider group, and think about where we're going to put horticulture. Who's going to be producing meat? Where's the bread going to be baked? All of these things, all of this capacity that a city like Norwich has completely lost. And we ran that project until 2012. And there was one element that we left right to the end, which was in this new sustainable food system, we needed to think about the huge fields that surround the city, the huge fields like the one I showed in that photo right at the beginning. How do we transform those? It's all very well to set up a 5-acre market garden, but there are millions of acres of arable land in the UK that need to be urgently changed. And the way to do that is to create a positive route to market that incentivizes change on farm. And the crops that are being grown there are beans, cereals, oilseeds. They're anonymous. They disappear into commodity food production. They're used to make industrial foods that frankly do us more harm than good more often than not. And we wanted to reconnect people with that production. We wanted to encourage farmers to think of themselves as food producers rather than as commodity producers. And in order to do that, we began with field beans. These are the field beans here on the left of the screen as you look at it. On the right are the North American beans, the Phaseolus beans, New World beans. These are beans that used to be eaten very widely, really up until about 300 or 400 years ago, when they became stigmatized as a poor person's winter food because you couldn't afford meat, so you had to eat beans. But they're delicious. They're eaten all over the world. And yet most farmers just think of them as pig food or an export crop to go to North Africa for human consumption. And we began by just buying export quality beans, which are fantastic. In fact, North Africa has a higher specification for human consumption than we do in the UK. We made some postcards. We asked people to try them and to give us some feedback. And we put them into box schemes. We made them available in shops. We took them to events. And we had an incredible response. People were fascinated. There was this crop growing around the city that they'd seen and had not realized they could eat. And we realized it was something we needed to do. And we needed to create a route to market to enable farmers to get a higher value return for that crop, to be able to grow more of it in order to make a bigger contribution in terms of things like substituting synthetic nitrogen for plant-based nitrogen that's fixed from the atmosphere by the beans. We put it in
sorry to
boxes.
interrupt, I'm just going to give a one minute warning.
Yeah, that's great. I am going on and on. We put them in beautiful boxes. And then we began to realize that as the volumes increased, we could work directly with farmers. We could ask them to grow specific crops for us, things like the beautiful Carlin pea, which is a sort of heritage variety that's not widely grown because it's challenging. And that meant that we had to work out what price we needed to pay for that crop. We needed to ask the farmer to calculate what the cost of production was. And then we could then work with our customers to understand what they were willing to pay and therefore what volume should be produced. And there's a critical balance there of managing supply and demand. The temptation for farmers is to produce as much as they can because that's the model, but the reality is that depresses the prices. And this is Mark Lee, the first farmer we work with directly, an organic farm in Shropshire. We work with farmers all over, this is Wakelands, we work with farmers all over the UK, principally because we need to work with farmers who are engaged, want to engage in this change and have the attention to detail and the skills to do that. Over the last 10 years, we've developed new crops like lentils and quinoa and chia, working directly with our farmer group. And we've been able to do that, not because they were difficult to grow and we've managed some magic, but because we have a route to market that recognizes the risk the farmers are taking and the cost of production. And now we have a whole host of fascinating crops bought directly from farmers, processed and cleaned by us, and then supplied out to everyone from individual retail customers on our website through to food processors and manufacturers that are making products from those, all the time maintaining that transparency, that traceability of provenance, and celebrating our relationships with those farmers that we work with. And we do that by creating other communications. So we sent 3 writers to 3 farms to just be inspired and moved by whatever they saw. This was part of Diver Impacts, and it's produced a beautiful little book that has a different way of telling stories about what's happening on farm. And then, as we were big and national to start with, and we still are, we're thinking about relocalizing that and thinking bioregionally in our Waveney Valley. Where could we make production happening? And we're reframing the big questions and thinking about how we could change the landscape locally. And I am very conscious that I've run out of time, but thank you.
No, thank you very much, Josiah. That was fascinating and great to really see, showing the importance of building networks and building trust between farmers and suppliers and people in that system. So that was really great. Okay, next, I'm going to hand over to George Young from Fobbing Farms. So over to you, George.
Perfect. Cool. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you very much for coming along to this session on supply chains. It's actually something that I spend far too much time thinking about. So I am George Young, aka Farming George, an agroecological mixed farmer from Fobbing in South Essex. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a different presentation to the ones you've just seen. This is kind of a lot of my thoughts about where we need to go with supply chains and things like that. And I have no solutions, just an awful lot of thoughts. But for a start, I thought I would define what agroecology means for me and for how I farm and how I think. Now, the FAO actually has a superb list of 10 elements you can find on their website. But for me, I like to really simplistically break it down into these 3 simple tenets. So number 1 is farming with nature. This is about trying to introduce nature into every part of our farming system and mirror natural systems in the ways that I grow my produce and the ways that I rear my livestock as well. Then there's circular farming. This is about keeping waste streams on farm and converting those waste streams into secondary products, ensuring as much as possible that the only nutrition that leaves the farm is the actual food product itself. So a really easy example of this could be utilizing the waste bran from milling white flour on farm to feed pigs or chickens. And then finally, there's food sovereignty. So of course, food security is the ability of a nation to feed itself. And our government here has taken the really simplistic route, doing trade deals to ensure that we have food on the shelves, irrelevant to its provenance. Now that of course keeps food cheap, which keeps the population happy, and that keeps government in power. So it's not a surprise why they've gone down that route. Food sovereignty, on the other hand, is not only about feeding your people, but ensuring that those people also understand how and why the food is grown or reared in that way, such that they genuinely care about their food, which should, of course, in theory, lead to less food waste. So I'm just going to really quickly whiz through how I farm. I've been home farming for 9 years now, converting a very conventional arable farm, growing 3 crops, into the one that I've got written about on this slide here. So I'm a sort of small to medium-sized farm. The home farm is about 650 acres, and the overall farm size I farm is about 1,200 acres. Everything here is actually what I'm concentrating on the home farm, so on that 650 acres at home. So I farm with those aforementioned agroecological principles front and centre. However, I am fully aware that the way that I'm farming here in Fobbing is fully catering to a middle-class consumer, someone who probably wants to show off to their friends about where they buy their food and why they buy it that way. And it's unlikely to be a farming system that can be rolled out wholesale across the UK. For one, it is a tremendous amount of work. There's a huge amount of intrinsic risk in much of what I'm doing here. And much as though I'm happy to take on that risk, you could never expect other farmers to conform to the same risk profile as me. You know, I spend a lot of time working on marketing. I spend a huge amount of time, well, more time than I normally find in my day. Now, of course, much as though I'm happy to farm in this way, in fact, I absolutely love it, there needs to be an alternative solution for those farmers who think differently and have alternative skill sets to me. So when thinking about supply chains, I think it's really imperative to understand the political system in which we are currently working. So RFC for years has been championing small-scale agroecological farms as the future of food production. And yes, I think that would be lovely. I would love that to actually be the case, but I'm sorry, I really don't think it will be. It's just not the world we live in anymore. And the majority of the population would actually rather work in offices than get their hands dirty. Small farms are also often quite expensive farms. They are farms without the ability to afford mechanization, which consequently means increased labor costs, all of which rolls through to the cost of the food for the end consumer, or as I often see producers not taking living wages because they want to ensure that their produce is affordable. And for me, this actually kind of undermines those methods of food production rather than promoting them. You know, I don't think we should be afraid of sensibly implemented mechanization and automation. And of course, then the big push at the moment is carbon credits. Now, I'm sure every person here understands how stupid that is and how it's going to do very little, if anything, to solve our climate crisis, but governments absolutely love them. Economically, they are the next cash cow. So they're here to stay. And of course, biodiversity credits, they're just around the corner. So I see this, you know, when we're looking at what's happening in the UK overall, I see this as a really major reason that we're going to see land prices rise and possibly soar. I really hope I'm wrong, but kind of simplistic carbon creditation will enable companies to pay a fortune for land only to take it out of food production, instead growing a carbon sequestering forest or a biodiversity rich rewilding project. Now, of course, whether or not carbon and biodiversity are genuine outcomes is irrelevant. It's just the way that the political landscape is moving. The way I see this is that, you know, we're going to see small farms being squeezed out. The survivors are going to be people catering to middle classes, catering to niche markets, and really thinking outside of the box. We're going to see a trend to considerably larger farms. Even as land ownership itself doesn't change, small farms are going to need to get contractors in, or they're going to need to allow their land to be tenanted, because it's not going to be viable for them to be farming that land themselves. And it's here that I'd also like to make the argument for a macro localized food production system over a hyperlocal one. Hyperlocal is not resilient, even though the idea of it is very, very beautiful and very romantic. So for me, last year was an absolute prime example of this. Here in Essex, we had a massive hailstorm in July that wiped out all of the pea crops in our area, including my own, and also including my lovely crop of lentils. So Josiah, apologies once again. The UK itself has the potential to be the perfect macro local system with a great deal of inherent weather resilience. In my opinion, we shouldn't be afraid to have a supply chain that works fully with farms all over the UK. Yeah, if you take the UK and pop the size of it into America, they would think that is a hyperlocal system, not a macro local system. So we should really embrace that and understand what benefits we've got with the maritime climate here in the UK. Now, of course, as I said earlier, I've got some ideas as to how to solve supply chain issues, but I've no means got any solutions. What I think is necessary is for any new supply chains to fully incentivize agroecological production methods. And if farms do get larger and we can create non-commodity supply chains with agroecology at their heart, the biodiversity and carbon credits will be absolutely staggering. And actually, the way I think of this is that if we can actually get most of the land in the UK to reduce its inputs, that's actually going to be overall a better result for biodiversity and for carbon than getting a very small percentage of farms to eliminate all of their inputs. So it's kind of looking, for me, it's looking at a bigger picture of what those supply chains can actually create in what they do. Because I fervently believe that any new system should be built from the bottom up, with farmers having a really key stake in it. And for me, international trade should be the last piece of the puzzle. It should not be the first piece. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's ideas in the breakout session.
Thank you very much, George. Very fascinating. And I think it shows how, yeah, we definitely need to look at this as the whole system and how different levels and scales can all kind of work and coexist together, and thinking about it in that holistic way to its true sense. So no, very good. And 3 fantastic talks. Thank you very much to everybody there. And hopefully we can kind of take those talks and start sort of discussing them in the breakout rooms, which we'll move into now. We're running a little bit over time, but not too much. So we'll have about 25 minutes or so for the breakout rooms. There should hopefully be one of the speakers in each room, except for mine, which I'll be doing by myself. And then there'll be a couple of people helping to take notes in the rooms as well. So yeah, it's really an opportunity for you to ask questions and to add to the discussion, as I explained at the start. So Emma, who's helping us with Emma from ORFC, is helping us with the tech and stuff, is going to hopefully start assigning people to breakout rooms, and hopefully it all works nice and smoothly.
All set whenever you want.
Lovely, thank you, Emma. Yeah, if you want to click go, then that would be lovely. And see you all back here in about 20-25 minutes or so. yeah, hope you all managed to have a great conversation. We had a really good one in our breakout room talking about all sorts of things. So I think for the last 10 minutes, what we're going to do is quickly kind of sum up. Someone from each group is going to sum up the conversation they had and maybe mention one or two of the main points that they had. I can see Katie's still talking with her group. Managed to get a local group of people together, which was great. So, but yeah, we'll do that, and then we'll probably kind of end there. We might quickly sort of try and explain some things we'll take from this and where we'll take them next. So, I was in group one, so I'll just quickly a quick 1 minute kind of summary. So somebody was talking about. They supply to Avon Cole at the moment, and one of the things that they like about supplying to that sort of supply chain or market was the ability to negotiate prices with them and not to be what a lot of farmers unfortunately have to be in certain circumstances, which is price takers. And I think there was some really interesting conversation around somebody who runs a village shop and also has some land and trying to use that land to supply to help farmers supply to local village shop, but maybe that didn't quite work out. So looking at starting a food hub to help farmers kind of concentrate food into that. There's some really interesting conversations around kind of some barriers. So for example, a lot of farmers these days are using contractors for certain tasks on the farm. So the contractors also need to be on the same wavelength as the farmer if they're to grow more niche or heritage varieties to sell into different markets can be difficult. A lot of conversation around kind of getting people to value food more and what is the value, what value do people put on food, and how can you get that over to people so that they can make that change. And then lastly, the last thing I'll just sort of touch on is that some really interesting actual conversations around food service and the hospitality, sort of catering, hospitality, food service side of things, and sort of looking at opportunities to try and supply more locally, but that can be quite difficult to do. But whether a food hub kind of thing is one way to do that or not. But yeah, some really rich conversation, which was great. So Group two, I can't remember who group two was, but whoever was going to feedback from group two, do you want to come in and give a quick update?
Yeah, I can do that on group two behalf. It was me and George. Yeah, so well, we started with a little bit of historical stuff about weight clins, how difficult it was in the early years getting supply chains going, particularly for potatoes. But there were very, very small starts of things such as a local club, really representing the beginning of what we're seeing now with local supply chains. There was mention also about the risk of to farmers needing to be recognised. So, for example, grains and pulses are dealt with in high volumes, and if there's any risk in that supply chain, then if there are any problems in the supply chain, then this represents a very high risk for these particular farmers. Also, there was mention that when we're developing sustainable chains, then networking is critical to keep these going. There was mention of commodity systems, and although they've worked well, there was a reflection that they'd gone too far, in the sense that farmers were having to work with too many people so that they couldn't function efficiently in their primary role as growers. And there was some issue about some supply chains with working with farmers. So when you've got a lot of supplies coming in, essentially oversupplies, there were challenges with efficient invoicing. So farmers weren't getting paid efficiently and on time. And there's a particular supply chain network in Norwich that are now introducing an electronic invoicing system, which is set up to resolve this problem. There was some comments from the Better Food Shed model talking about the usefulness of having something that acts as a hub So an aggregation which works for both sides. They're making real difference to both farmers and retailers. And although this looked like a normal retail system, it puts the farmers first so that their needs are addressed. And an example of this was making retailers aware of time-sensitive crops. One of the problems with that was that not all wholesalers are responding positively to their farmers' needs, but the Better Food Shed wants to develop a kind of advisory or information service so that they can recommend appropriate wholesalers to different farmers. And really this comment again that farmers want to do the growing and let others do the selling. This was really supported by some historical comments about Riverford, and really that was set up to do growing, but really had to evolve its own systems and has now very sophisticated networks with communications and IT systems and a network of hubs, not just a network, but lots of hubs that feed off each other, which now works very well.
Sorry to interrupt, Lindsay. We might just have to move on to another group just because we've only got I think 2 minutes left until we have to close the session. But that was really interesting conversation, it sounds like, in that group. So thank you very much. Rowan, if I could ask you to just give a very quick sort of 1 minute maximum update, that would be great.
Thanks, James, and nice to meet everyone. I was just about able to keep track of lots of really great ideas in our group and a real dispersion across the country as well. We've had Land's End all the way up to Durham, so really exciting coverage of the UK. We talked a lot about the challenges in setting up sort of local food networks, so the trade-offs different people might face, in terms of increasing output, but then also the increase in food miles you may get alongside that, and also the complexity of handling lots and lots of different products. That sort of moved us on to the different tools that are available to people, and thinking about the Open Food Network, Ubi, Julie mentioned they use Boxmaster, I think, for their veg box schemes, and sort of thinking about how those can help facilitate more of this in the future. And then we also talked about the issue of agroecological produce being kind of boxed in as a sort of local and niche product, and the need to sort of break out of that and tap into much wider networks and markets. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Rowan. And Charlotte or Josiah, if you could come in and give us a very quick whistle-stop tour of your conversation, that'd be great.
Well, no, we were lucky enough to have the poster boy for Hodmeddod, Mark, join us and tell us all about the kind of turning point that he experienced while developing the relationship, working with them as a business. And then we discussed how that can be replicated in other ways and that it's not straightforward. But Josiah kind of said there's needs to be space for reflection and looking at how we communicate with one another, but also not penalizing when things go wrong, and building that kind of encouragement for long-term supply so that you know that you can have that reliable kind of route for the farmers to have a market, but also then for your customers as well. And then we had a bit of kind of people wondering about how they would go about setting up a similar business to Hodmeddod's, and very briefly just kind of make sure that there's demand, understand what already exists, and like really get to know your customer base and what is available in your local area in terms of infrastructure, so that you're not creating a lot of work for yourself that you kind of might not be able to manage in the future. Kind of have a vision for where you want to head. You won't be there straight away, but have some first steps for how to get there. Is that fair enough, Josiah?
Yeah, beautiful, perfect.
Thank you very much. And Katie, I think you have about 30 to 40 seconds to quickly sum up.
You've got a nice board there.
You have a lovely board, yeah. Do you want to give us a very, very quick sum up?
Board, yeah. In a nutshell, is the sound awful? There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So in a nutshell, yeah, we've got one of the growers here is working with better food traders and was talking about how the Slack panel is really useful, exchanging with other growers and having that kind of label. And then also the Farmer Food Co-op, which started off as a net buying collective, but also now producers bring in produce together into the hub. So looking at how to tie together transport between them. So there was ideas around lift sharing the transport, so much stuff I'm not going to have time because I know it's already 1:30. So yeah, a new idea that a new initiative called the Hive that has a hub area with refrigeration and electric vehicles based on different farms across Cornwall. And so yeah, looking at collaboration basically for transport and distribution between growers. And yeah, just the big challenge in Cornwall is the distances really versus some of the other examples we've seen. So how that kind of collaboration in transport and infrastructure. So yeah. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Katie. Well, we're going to have to very quickly wrap it up. So just to say, massive thank you to all the speakers who have spoken today. Really great. I hope you found it really interesting and engaging, and we might aim to do some sort of blog or something to try and sum up the conversation that we've had at the session, and really great. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your ORFC 2022 experience, and hopefully see you all around some point soon in the future. Thank you very much.